Okay, let's go.
Okay. Well, perfect. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Friday conversations. Thank you very much for spending your lunch break with us. We're going to have a very inspiring conversation today within the context of our project, COVID-19 and Us by Magnum Photos and You. And the whole idea of this project is to work with photographers all around the world and with you to better understand what is going on in our daily lives, to help us make sense of the major disruption that the pandemic has brought upon us, and how actually we can, through images and different perspectives on a shared experience, make sense of what we have all been through individually and of course are still facing right now. So we've been addressing different themes over the past weeks, and this week we thought we would talk about something that connects all the themes, and that is really the backbone of the entire project, and that is looking. How can we look at the situation? How can we, through images from people all around the world, Magnum photographers, understand what is going on? How do we tell this story in images? And how these images you're seeing right now might be actually very different from other images you have seen in the media. So looking at the pandemic and how the pandemic is looking at us from a certain perspective is the theme today. And to talk about this, I'm extremely happy and honored to have two prominent guests who are acclaimed experts in their own fields and who know a lot about how to look at things. And I'm very much looking forward to introducing them to you. Just before I do that, I wanted to explain to you how we put this together this time. We shared with our guests the entire list of works which we are presenting in the museum. We reopened a month ago now, and these Magnum images are progressively taking over our space, just as the pandemic has taken over our lives. And we asked our guests to pick images for each, which really struck them at a first look. So that's what we're going to dive into. And of course, you will have the opportunity as well to share with us what your favorite images this week. We'll run a poll towards the end of the conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and welcome Nathalie Herschdorfer. Hello, Nathalie.
Hello.
So Nathalie, thank you very much for joining us. You are a very inspiring curator and art historian specialized in the history of photography. You are a museum director. You are at the head of the Museum of Fine Arts in Locle, Switzerland. You have produced and organized numerous exhibitions all around the world on big names of photography, huge retrospectives, theme-based productions, and also with a very strong eye for contemporary photography, which is happening right now. You have published numerous key books, amongst which the Thames and Hudson Dictionary of Photography, so you're a pretty good person to talk about photography. And you're also a teacher at the ECAL Art School here in Switzerland. So I have a brief question for you before I introduce our second guest. Every time I call you or every time I email you, you're basically going somewhere. So it's always going from one city to another, one country to another. That is very much the case in the photography world. How have you and how has the photography world kind of adapted to these past few months?
Well, as everybody now, everything is like more online than anything real. I mean, being based in Switzerland and in Europe, we can start now again our travels. And I was in Italy last week. But this is true that looking at what is happening in the world online, that's the new experience. That's a contemporary experience we have all today. And this is an experience on very small screens. We are looking through these windows, but it's a very small window from home. So that's what our world is today.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about that with you, Derk Segaar. Hi, Derk. Welcome.
Hi, Pascal.
And we're going to talk about that with you through the images you've chosen, and I think to be really at the center of our conversation today, that we're looking at the pandemic through a screen. That's the thought we can keep in mind. But first, Derk, to talk about you, I love the way you introduce yourself in your biography. You introduce yourself as a storyteller, and I do that all the time as well. And the story you tell is that of Red Cross and Red Crescent volunteers all around the world. You are the Director of Communications of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, which is based here in Geneva, but oversees action literally in every country around the world. You have extensive experience internationally in different leadership positions, many years with the United Nations. You have also worked in the field, in Darfur, in South Sudan, in Somalia, in Kenya, leading key negotiations in North Darfur, for example. And you also have experience in journalism on different continents. So I'm extremely honored and happy to welcome you too. And you shared with me something, a thought that really struck me when we were preparing this conversation. Of course, the IFRC, the International Federation, is really at the front lines of this pandemic all around the world. And then suddenly you told me something that I hadn't really thought of, although I know it, but it just didn't connect in my brain. This is not your institution's first pandemic. And that's a very interesting thing to keep in mind. So how have you, as an organization, adapted over the past few months, and how are you doing?
Yeah, so the Federation, International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, was founded 100 years ago, basically during the last global pandemic, right? Yeah. The major flu pandemic in 1980, 1990. So it is in many ways sort of back to our origins, and for me, it's a really challenging moment, but also a very inspiring moment, because normally the Federation works with all these national societies. They're in 192 countries, 14 million volunteers, but 165,000 local offices, which really shows that they're almost there in every city, every town, every community around the world. So it's an intensely local organization, but with a global reach. And so it is normally we respond mostly to health outbreaks of smaller sizes or major natural disasters, but that usually affects 1 or 2 or 3 countries, maybe a region, but never the whole membership as a whole. So it really is a moment where the whole federation and all the national societies from all these countries are coming together, which is a huge challenge, but also a real inspiring moment. And it brings us back to really what we are, and that is at heart, we are a local organization of local volunteers in the community. They're already there, they don't have to be deployed, they already know who's vulnerable, and they speak the language, they know the culture, etc. And so in this moment in time when deploying overseas is so challenging, we actually show our core value in a way stronger than ever by already being there and being able to respond immediately, and to have that story told always through the local perspective, right, through in the different languages with an understanding of the local culture, rather than sort of an international response organization that is more removed sometimes from the real realities on the ground.
Well, that's of course a fascinating core element of the Federation, which makes it so strong, because you're already there. When whatever happens, you're in the field, and this local and, let's say, personal perspective is maybe also pretty much what connects all the images we're looking at again right now, because they're taken by individuals, photographers who have a very personal point of view on what is going on. And it's important to remind that the images that are shown here were taken by photographers who just stayed home and who are in their own culture and country, but also by photographers who suddenly got blocked somewhere and who got, in the middle of a trip somehow, couldn't go home anymore. And it's the case actually of the photographer you chose, and the image you chose, Derk, on the left of my screen, but I don't know if that means the right from the viewer's perspective.
Same left, same thing.
Okay. So on the left, There's this image by Zied Ben Hamdan, sorry for the pronunciation, Tunisian photographer. I'm just going to read the caption that goes with it. It was taken on March the 19th. And the photographer says, I'm currently in Canada for a personal trip. 2 days ago, the Tunisian government closed the borders and cancelled all flights to Tunisia. Unfortunately, I did not bring my camera, and maybe I will buy one in the coming days. So as you can see, I put the image you picked next to Nathalie's choice, because I feel somehow these two images have a lot in common. And the second image of the jigsaw puzzle, and every time I look at it, I just remember how many jigsaw puzzles I did with my children during confinement. That image is by Alex South, prominent American photographer, who pretty much says the same thing, but in a different way, because he says that, well, suddenly he's blocked, and suddenly he starts looking at things differently. So perhaps I would like to hear you both on why you chose these images, and we can take it from there. Nathalie, you want to jump in with Alex South?
Yeah. Well, it is interesting what is happening, because with this lockdown happening everywhere in the world, more or less simultaneously, many photographers, as you just said, were just, stuck at home or somewhere inside. And usually photography, when you go back to history of photography, photography is a way to discover the outside world. I mean, this is thanks to photography that we were able to have a better understanding about, different countries, cultures, landscapes, and photographers make us travel, even if we are at home. And suddenly these photographers, they cannot go outside. And for me, this Alexa's image is very interesting because, first of all, I mean, this is really an activity that you would do, very quietly at home or with your family. And it is about also, trying to figure out what you are going to do during the day, sharing time with your family, and also, having this notion of the time is passing quite slowly. So I thought that it was very interesting. And still, this is not just a single illustration of a puzzle. It is for me much more than, he is building his photography. This is this light, coming right on this oblique on the image, and suddenly you look at this image and you see a landscape. So suddenly you realize, so okay, photography cannot show us what's going on outside this dangerous world, and here we are looking at this landscape. So I think it is about, turning the camera from the outside world where photographers should be, to home, to family, to also about time. It is also turning the camera to try to illustrate this passage of time, which I think it's very strong in this image.
It's true that, and this is how I connected actually both images. It's true that in this image, we're looking at a jigsaw puzzle, but it felt to me like we're looking at time. We're looking at time that's frozen. And we're looking at something else, which is attention, that suddenly, well, you look at things differently because you're blocked somehow and you have to look at them. And I'm just going to read what Alex South says about this photograph, and then we'll have a look at your choice, Derk. The photographer is talking about how he appreciates the landscape, how he doesn't need to go to France to take the image of the mountain. And then he says, it's just a matter of quieting oneself and paying attention. But this is hard to do during a pandemic, and it feels like we're falling off a cliff. But if I turn off my iPhone and simply watch the light, I can see that the world is still spinning. So the light in this image, Derk, the one you chose, is at the core of what's going on. But you also had a very interesting perspective on this image. You might want to share it.
Sure. So I mean, I was drawn to this picture immediately, and it's I think my favorite in the whole series. I'm a total minimalist, so that very biased to images like this. But for me, I mean, white in its different shades is the color of mourning, and for me, this picture represents the grieving about life that, as we knew it, that has been stripped from a lot of its essentials, and the things that give us joy in life. And you see it literally come down. I mean, I don't know what the little balls, whether they're eggs or not, but for me it was sort of water and eggs, right? It's really, even the food choices have reduced, if you're lucky to access food at all, obviously. And it's really bringing down, there's nothing else there, right? I mean, again, it's the world coming to a halt, to a sort of stillness in its most essential form. And also you have one chair there only, and that's also it also sickens me, also linking to the idea of mourning and grieving. It represents loneliness and isolation to me as well, and where a lot of people went obviously through this. And again, on the Red Cross Red Crescent side of our core work was actually a huge spike in responding to mental health issues as a result of COVID. And I mean, even this picture could be an institution in a way, right? Where people also confined and while they struggle, I just felt, even while the text has very little in the picture, I felt it brings up a lot of how people have experienced this pandemic.
Well, and I think you hit the nail on the head here, Derk, because that is why it was so obvious to me that we had to do this project with MAGNUM. It's this very capacity to tell a story in an image, and there's not much going on in this kitchen, it's true, but it invites you as a viewer to project so much image, so much meaning into it. And perhaps I can share with you where we're going to put these two images. So Alex South and the second photographer, Cette. In the exhibition, we're going to hang them in 2 weeks from now, or in 1 week. My team might get mad at me if I get my dates wrong, but it doesn't matter. We're going to install them in this room in the exhibition, a permanent exhibition, where we present prisoners' objects, very specific objects that were created by people in prison. And we're not, claiming that what we've been through over the past few months has anything to do with what it means to be in prison. But I think for many people around the world, the past few months have been the first time they've actually been restricted in their movements. They have been free to live the way they want, or they usually do. And perhaps through such images as this one, you might imagine what it means to have that other experience, which is in the museum. So that's the type of conversation we're having here. And I'm moving on now to this next image, bouncing back on your idea, Derk, that the pandemic, and yours too, Nathalie, kind of pushes us into looking at things. We were talking about time, we were talking about light, and then suddenly there's this huge contradiction that the pandemic is all around us, it's huge, but we don't actually see it, or we see it through these frames, as you've said, Nathalie, where we're all confined somehow, and we don't know, or we don't experience what frontline workers are going through. This is a bit what you were talking about to me, Derk. I'd like to hear it in your words. Why did you choose this image, and how it can make us think about what we're seeing and what we're being given to see?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's an intensely intimate image, right? You're looking right at the heart of the crisis and the heart of the action, but at the same time, you're a step removed from that really kind of jarring image of that represents the crisis. So, I mean, often with humanitarian work, I think a lot of us think about it of something that is happening far away. And with COVID, it really, all of a sudden, everybody was affected, and this crisis was happening right inside our own communities. But there was something strange happening, and which made it kind of surreal and almost alienating. In the same way, as we look sort of from some distance and through a window, we're not part of the action. We're looking at the crisis, but from a distance. I think it's been for many people very surreal and alienating for this to be happening in their own community, but still not really seeing that crisis, not really being part of the crisis, being one step removed. So it's very hard then for people also to see the full picture of what is really, happening outside of your home, outside of the frame of this picture. As we are looking at what is happening outside of this frame, you don't get to the full picture. And I think that also has resulted in a lot of this alienation or mistrust. Even if you have seen a lot of misinformation and distrust going on, as a real infodemic. And again, it's been actually also on the com side, one of the main things we've been responding to is to try and respond to this incredible wave of misinformation, of people not getting the full picture of what is actually happening. Yeah, so that's why this really it hit home again from various perspectives for me.
Well, so then in that case, Nathalie, as a photographer, you have to make a choice. I mean, what do you do? I just always remember of Kappa and how he says, you know, if you're not close enough, it's not good enough. But in this case, you can't. And is it even a necessity to show what's actually going on? What kind of choices can you make as a photographer?
Well, I think it's really part of photography, you know, of the photographer's role in our society is also about, it is mostly about documenting what is happening in the world. And here you have a photographer documenting about the pandemic or trying to. And what is important is without such images, such pictures, the virus would be very difficult to understand, or it would be harder to combat, because that's something that really shows the impact on human lives. Because you've seen that image, even if it's like a window into this window, which is photography. But here you see, you know, human beings fighting, human beings, like, you know, hospitals and the people who is sick fighting the virus. And this is very clear, very real in that sense. And I think these images help us to understand what's happening also in the world, because it's very difficult to understand. And we see figures, we know about the number of cases, it's all about statistics. And we need images to really understand what's happening. And this is, you know, photographers' role to bring such images.
But how do you strike the right balance? That's maybe an interesting question for you, Derk, because as Director of Communications, you have to ask yourself this question all the time, I guess. How do you show humanitarian action? How do you put into images? How do you tell a story about what's going on? And how do you strike this balance between perhaps being very brutal and showing facts and really disturbing images, or calling upon people's imagination? How do you deal with that?
Yes, a very good question, Pascal. I mean, one of the key things, I mean, first of all, I would always, I mean, it's literally part of our visual guidelines to not you know, depict suffering in a very, very extreme way. Sure. You know, because what we want to project with our imagery is hope as well, showing the problem and showing the suffering in some way, but also hope. And the other really key thing is to preserve the dignity of people who often have lost so much already, who are suffering so much in that moment. So you cannot have pictures where, you know, where you feel that people affected by crisis are entirely powerless and you know, sort of stripped from their dignity and their humanity. So that is absolutely key for us in the way we want to portray things. And maybe a final thing is, but that's hard, of course, with photography. I'm very keen also that who is telling the story? And it's too often, it's sort of and this is maybe a little bit charged, but, you know, like the white savior coming to other places, you know, to help the poor people. And that I really I want to change around, and I see it less and less, thank God. But, you know, and how do we put the voice and the agency back in the people who have been affected? How do we, you know, help to let them tell their own story? Because that is also a much more interesting and inspiring story than to hear the story of people looking from the outside in.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's a thought to keep in mind as we move on to this image by the same photographer, Jed, who's still in Canada, who left his kitchen and who eventually went to buy some cigarettes or something like that. This image is extremely striking. You chose it, Derk, and we're going to talk about it. I mean, just imagine seeing this image 6 months ago. I mean, nobody would have understood it. It's crazy how we look at this as something normal now, which wasn't normal at all only recently. But Nathalie, I also look at this image and I have this question for you. Maybe we could just reflect upon it. It's on one hand, the pandemic is also revealing things or pushing us to be much more aware of our privileges and understand who the real heroes are in our daily lives. I mean, who actually makes our daily lives function. And there have been so many images about, you know, frontline workers, people who clean up our streets, who actually make things run in grocery stores and so forth. I have the feeling, but this is more of a hypothesis, that this is not new in the history of photography. There have been moments when photographers were very curious about all these small trades, as we call them when referring to Irving Penn, and kind of documenting all these jobs and different trades. Have you seen a lot of that right now, or how do you find these images different or similar from others in the history of photography?
Well, I think it is true that we live now in a time where we look more, I guess, or look in a more conscious way on these anonymous people. You know, we still, the 20th century was more a time where we would, you know, celebrate very, you know, well-known people. We need to recognize people who have names, you know, politicians or actors or singers. I mean, our culture is very much, you know, full of these images, and shifting to these anonymous people or these, you know, like as you call the small trades. Of course, we have seen that in history of photography. But I think today, what we see with this pandemic is that also the need for photographers to go to unexplored territory. There's something different to show and how it affects our daily life. So such an image for me, it is really about that, because in a way, when you look at it, you could see, well, there's nothing photogenic there. You know, it's like, you know, as a subject matter, what is it about? But then everything you now, you fill this image with a lot of other information that you have received in these recent months. So suddenly this image, as you just said, wasn't really meaningful. I would say 6 months ago, or we wouldn't understand really what was happening. This guy behind his, you know, plastic thing, protecting itself. It's a bit crazy. And today it is more like, documenting about, you know, daily life, what we all have in our daily life.
And seeing heroes, although I'm uncomfortable with this word, I must say, because the problem with the word hero is what happens when the crisis is over, and they still are heroes, but are we still going to call them heroes? And that's the thing we were discussing, Derk, and I think for your organization, well, you personally and the organization has a very strong point of view on that, because you work with millions of volunteers around the world who are everything about the daily lives. And were you thinking about that when you chose this image, or what brought you to this?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, right. So our overall mandate for the Red Cross and Red Crescent is always to try and look at the most vulnerable, those most in need. And so that is ongoing work in any society, right, including in very developed economies in Western countries. But I don't think it's always as visible as it has become through this pandemic. And I think it has sort of the idea of extreme inequality and vulnerabilities that has often sort of been associated with things happening far away in fragile economies and what have you. All of a sudden, that sort of narrative has been stripped away, and it's the reality of these inequalities and vulnerabilities have been become very apparent in our own societies. And what for me is the thing that I struggle with, and in terms of from a sense of fairness, is that those who are now very clearly seen as the most essential to keep our lives going and to be able to respond to this pandemic, the nurses, the cleaners, the shopkeepers, people delivering packages, at people's home, technicians who keep, various infrastructure running, etc. They are very often the worst paid, and they are very often the most vulnerable to, you see a disproportionate people in lower income groups affected by COVID themselves. So they are most at risk, and at the same time they're the most essential, and they're the worst paid. So I mean, I find that is a conundrum that I find really hard to deal with. And while I was very inspired by all the clapping for health workers, etc., and I mean, it touched me deeply, at the same time I wonder what happens once the clapping stops, and are we willing to address some of these structural inequalities and quite simply start paying these people much better.
Yeah, and as I told you, Derk, as my daughter, she's 4 years old. She asked me over dinner 2 days ago. She said to me, "Well, why did we stop clapping?" And it's true. Why did we stop clapping? And this reflection is also one within different generations. And it's interesting how the pandemic is revealing and showing how public spaces aren't made for certain groups of people, or that certain groups of people are unseen in these public spaces. We see this elderly person at home. Reminds me of my grandfather, who's 92 years old, and I called him a few days ago and said, "Well, how's it going? Have you been able to go outside, and you're keeping up with everything?" And he said, "Well, it doesn't change anything for me. I mean, pandemic or not, I'm not going outside anymore." So it's interesting to think of this entire group. You chose this photograph, Derk, and I must say that since I've been here at the Red Cross Museum, I've really discovered how involved the Red Cross is with elderly people and loneliness. You might want to share that, because it was a discovery for me.
Yeah, it was actually new to me too when I joined the Red Cross and Red Crescent some time ago, and there's huge programs, combating loneliness and mental health issues, providing helping to provide purpose and support for the most vulnerable groups, and especially to the elderly in the sort of individualized world, where sort of extended family structures are disintegrating. I mean, it is a real, in almost any society, I think it's a major focus of concern, and large programs within the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies are dedicated to this. So in that sense, when the COVID came and this group became the most vulnerable, it was a logical extension to spend a lot of effort on supporting them. And initially, if you just look at it at first glance, it sort of seems, this is somebody thanking whoever, provided food for him at home, say, thank you, and it's linked to the core of the Red Cross. So, I mean, it could be an uplifting image, but for me, it actually makes me very angry as well if I just let it sink in a little bit more. And it has a lot to do with the injustice of the elderly being so disproportionately affected by this pandemic, the injustice of them being locked up in care facilities or in their own homes, often dying alone, cut off from their loved ones, and seeing young people entirely disregarding the precautionary measures, not caring or taking their responsibility for other people in society. And finally, essentially, again, the story about who is telling the story. And I have seen, even while they are one of the prime affected groups in this pandemic, I've I don't think I've seen a single story from the elderly perspective themselves. They're talking about what they're going through. It's very much from the outside looking in. They are not also, so I don't hear their voice, and I don't see them having any influence on decisions that affect them, right? That affect their lives. So I think that, so there's a lot of anger with me as well if I see this and the injustice that comes with it.
Yeah, that's a very strong point, and it's amazing how Jean Gomy, the photographer here, managed to say so much with so little. Nathalie, how do you look at this portrait?
Well, that's a very powerful image, you know, looking at this face, because what I first see, this is this hand and the eyes of this man, you know, holding carefully these vegetables. I mean, the way that he carried these vegetables, the way he looks outside, the way he has his hands there, it says so much. And he's like, you know, behind this closed window. So for me, it is a very, I mean, you don't need a caption for that. No, you understand, you understand everything. And what is interesting in photography, sometimes the caption would completely shift, you know, the way you look at an image. You know, even you add one word and it can be suddenly the meaning is completely different. But here, I mean, with such an image, you don't need any caption. It is very clear about, you know, this person being put aside, closed windows, and just having some food. Yeah.
Well, I am going to read you the caption of this next image, which you picked, Nathalie. It's now I'm under pressure because it's a Dutch name, and I just asked Derk how to pronounce it, so I'm going to do my best. It's Peter van Achtmel, something like that. Thank you. So my Dutch is terrible. But this is Brooklyn. This is Brooklyn, and I'm going to read you the caption. This was March 20th, so feels like yesterday, but actually it's quite a few months ago now. And the caption reads, "The changes in the neighborhood have been startling. One day, everyone was waiting online for brunch, racing around the track, playing basketball, and luxuriating in the sun as spring began blooming. And it became a virtual ghost town overnight. Frankly, I'm grateful. While the bars and restaurants were packed, it was clear the virus was running rampant." Isn't that an incredible caption, that suddenly this entire space changes? And you had a very interesting way of looking at this image and its space, Nathalie.
Well, yeah, because for me, when I discovered this image, it's like a collage, you know, it's like several images. First of all, I look at this woman on profile, you know, going into the street, and you see, you know, the trash around her, and she's wearing this mask, looking, you know, down, and it is kind of, you know, lonely. I mean, you know, lonely people in the street trying to just go through this war zone somehow, you know. It seems like the street is not a welcoming place. And then you have the other part of the image on the left, which seems kind of collage to me, because then you see different elements. You see all these tiers in the front ground, and then you have this other body, someone looking for food, maybe, you don't know. It seems like a very poor neighborhood. And then at the background, you have these buildings. So it is about the city, living in the city. And what we have learned with this pandemic is how difficult it is for people living in a city, or living in New York, living in big cities, actually, everywhere in the world. Yeah. In that sense, for me, this image also represents the full impact of the coronavirus crisis. You know, you have to go out, even though it is a lockdown and you are not supposed to go out except to you know, go to the pharmacy or buy some food. But then some people go out, or you have to find your way through this outside world. And you see a lot of chaos there. And for me, this image is about also this outside world that, you know, is like difficult to grab to.
So let's continue to go out, and Derk, I'm going to connect you to this thought with a very different outside world, photographed by Martin Parr. We're still outside, we're still in the city, but this is a totally different way of navigating the city. And Derk, perhaps I'd like to hear you on this other thought that really struck me during these past few months. We've all been confined some way or another, and it's been difficult for everybody, regardless of our personal situations. But it's very important to remember that maintaining social distances and having your own space is actually a privilege. You might want to share a few thoughts on that with us, Derk?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's especially when you two take these pictures next to each other. I would really say, I mean, it's about physical distancing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, especially from a Red Cross perspective, we say we don't want to social distance. We actually want to be socially close. We want to be socially very close, closer even than normal to give the assistance need, but physically distance, you know, to protect people. And it basically, I mean, these two pictures for me very clearly show that physical distancing is a privilege. And that is also something that I kept on reminding me, even we know within a relatively small apartment with no outside space, not even a balcony, and two tiny little children running around. Still, it was an incredible privilege to have a space to be able to social distance, to still have access to food, to be able to work remotely without, you know, putting people at risk, to be in Switzerland with excellent healthcare and also, you know, measures that still allowed you to go outside. Where if you compare this picture where people, yes, they are actually coming together and they're physically distanced, but it's almost recreational. They're still coming together and they can interact. Where, you know, the picture before this was clearly there's no choice for these people in the street, and you know, one person seemed to be homeless. You know, there's no choice to physical distance, right? So it just compounds the vulnerability of these most vulnerable groups already.
And Nathalie, you looked at this image from this perspective and also from another, which I thought was really interesting, because I was just reminded by your expertise in the body photography, how the body has been photographed throughout the 20th century and today. That's what caught your attention here. It's the body language and what people are doing in the image from a structural perspective.
Yeah, for me, it was very interesting, because we wouldn't understand this image again if we would have that, you know, even like in January, we don't understand what is this kind of new game happening between them, or like, you know, like small children, you know, playing in the ground, but in the playground. For me, it is a kind of new way of, you know, having your body with other people. And I agree with you, Derk. It is not about social distance here at all. Of course not. It is this physical distance, but people need to connect. And the way that this image shows these bodies in the space, the way now we fill the space, of course, we need to have a space, which is a kind of protective. And this is, you know, this is in a park, it's in nature somehow. With trees, with grass, it is a kind of protective space in that sense. And these bodies need to be together. And for me, it is really this photographer, Martin Parr, when he made this photograph, for me, he really helped to humanize this crisis. Because what we see is the need of people to feel connected somehow.
And nature has been a very big part of this connection to others. I mean, being with others in nature, or being with yourself. And this is a beautiful image. I find it extremely moving. We've just installed it in our permanent exhibition. We printed it. And you picked it, Nathalie, and I'd be very interesting to hear your perspective on it, and then to ask Derk to perhaps totally change that perspective. So I'll let you go first, Nathalie.
Well, it is interesting because you picked photographs from MAGNUM photographers.
Yeah.
And here what we see is these professional photographers, they turn the camera from war or conflict zone to family and to home. And this image is very strong for that, because the photographer now Gregory Halpern, I mean, he had the need to look at his own children.
Yeah.
He cannot really travel, he cannot go out, but here what we see is a kind of, for me, it's a beautiful image. It's a kind of fairy tale of these, children. They are now building a kingdom in nature, and the nature surround them in a way that they are completely, part of it. And it is true that even for me during this lockdown, it was very important to look at nature, to look at trees. We had a need to go to nature somehow. And this image really represent that. And I know that for some people, it wasn't possible at all to go outside and even have a walk in the forest, what we were able to do here in Switzerland. But for me, this image is really beautiful because it is a kind of way to bring you to your own kingdom of nature. Yeah. And for me, such an image, somehow help us to digest this crisis or this unspeakable, again, to show how human beings have the strength also to survive it and to build a kind of dream world.
Yeah, and perhaps also resilience, and this is where I can connect with you, Derk, because I've read recent statements and news about activities carried out by the Federation and also ICRC, with this thought that for many people around the world, actually nature is not that safe haven at all right now. Nature is a threat, and climate change is an added threat upon the pandemic. So it's surely not what Gregory Halpern wanted to say here, but perhaps it connects again with this idea of vulnerable communities and how nature is totally different from one place to another where the Federation works.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, this image, it does show that how important it is to live in balance with nature. But it is this ironic, and I don't know if ironic is the right word, but striking at least that that the whole movement as a whole, the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, elevated climate change to its #1 priority to tackle, even while it is a humanitarian organization that really deals with humans and human suffering, but they feel that the key thing that needs to be addressed in right now and into the future is the way we deal with nature and the way that we basically are not living in harmony with nature and the devastating effects that is having. I mean, most pandemics, they start because of our encroachment into natural habitats, and that's how viruses and diseases they jump from wildlife to humans. But in terms of climate change, also our entire unsustainable way of living with nature and basically destroying it in an unimaginable scale makes that we see the impact of climate change, climate-related disasters just growing exponentially, and it's entirely unknown territory, right? Because the influence that we have on nature and our inability to strike that balance is hurting us and is going to hurt us in a way. And so we are trying to prepare for that in all kind of ways. The solution is also nature again, right? So a lot of nature-based solutions are being put forward as the way how we need to find and refine that balance. And I hope that COVID, the way it's brought the world to a sort of a moment of stillness and all of a sudden hearing the birds again, right? And a lot of the noise and a lot of the pollution that all of a sudden disappears. I lived in Delhi before my job here, and we was dealing with all the air pollution there, and to all of a sudden see pictures of my friends there clear blue skies over New Delhi, all of a sudden you can reimagine what the world looks like, without this detrimental influence of humanity on it. And I just hope that it carries beyond this COVID outbreak, and that people retain those memories of what's, the clean air and a quickly recovering nature, dolphins in Venice, in the canals in Venice, and all those kind of stories. I hope people will retain that and translate that into action.
Well, that's a very good thought to keep in mind, and perhaps also just to remember. I missed a slide, so sorry everybody. I'm just going to go right up to remember that what we're all experiencing, this global pandemic, is actually experienced in a very different way, and the way you look at it is always different depending on who's telling the story, what's happening outside the frame. And as I always say, it's so important to have this visual literacy and visual competencies, because as you were saying at the very beginning of our conversation, Nathalie, that little frame we have here is now in so many ways shaping the way we understand our experiences and what's happening. So being able to critique and to look beyond the image and to always remember that it's not reality is a central aspect, I think. And perhaps it's our contribution as a museum and cultural people to the ongoing situation. So I know I'm totally over time, but you have such fascinating things to say that we went a little over the 45 minutes we had planned. I would like to ask our viewers what their favorite photograph is, and Alessa's going to run a poll for us. Thank you very much. And as it's running, I'd like to ask you a very easy question, Derk and Nathalie, which is, I think about all the time, super easy. What's a good photograph? Write a thesis about that. What's a good photograph for you, Nathalie?
Well, I have to say that for me, I still think that a good photograph is not necessarily something beautiful or something well composed. It's not about this part. It's not necessarily about the subject matter. But for me, I realize that, some images are really haunting. Some images penetrate our hearts, penetrate our minds, and we live with them. And when we look at the other images, I constantly think about these images that are in my mind, and I can have them as a reference or as a comparison. And I really think that these mental images, some of the images, they are mental images that we will keep. So my mental images may be very different from your mental images, but I think that these are images that have an impact. They are emblematic, or they help us to really think about the world, to think about what we are looking. And for me, these images, these haunting images are crucial, and we need photographers to make them, produce them. And here, there are some of them here.
And Derk, it looks like the photograph here you chose is the most haunting image for our viewers today. What is a good photograph for you, Derk?
That's such a difficult question. I'm not the expert, but I mean, for me, it needs to touch. It needs to ask questions. It needs to touch your heart in a good way or a bad way or a haunting way. It needs to ask questions. Ideally, even spark action. But we know that images, right? I mean, you always say, one image is worth, 100 words or things like that. So in communication, we are very aware of that. And there's also in this day and age, if you look at sort of how we consume information, 75 to 80% is visual, and it's the degree of what we use words is less and less and less. So there's a huge responsibility also in terms of, the photographer, how they frame that reality, because there's so much happening outside of a frame. But essentially, it is about it needs to touch you in some way. That is what makes it good.
Absolutely. Well, listen, thank you both so much. It's been a really great conversation. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you also, Alessia, for helping out with the production. And I'm not going to leave you without answering the question myself. And Nathalie, to remind you of Leonard Fried, you know him very well for having produced a huge exhibition on him, Magnum photographer as well. And I asked him this question one day. I said to him, Leonard, what's a good photograph? And he had the best answer, and I always use it all the time. He simply said, a good photograph is one you want to look at a second time. So as simple as that. So I hope you'll join us again, and we'll talk about more photographs and see you at the museum soon. Nathalie, Derk, I wish you all the very best, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
It was a pleasure.
Bye.
Real pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.